Chapter 2, Culture. What is culture? Culture is a universal. It exists in all societies, yet the practices themselves may differ from one group to another. All humans possess culture. All human groups possess culture. The language, beliefs, values, norms, and material objects that are passed from one generation to the next. So culture is defined as the language, beliefs, values, norms, and material objects that are passed from one generation to the next. Each society develops shared, learned ways of perceiving and participating in the world around them. And culture itself can be divided into, when we talk about it, we can divide it into material culture and non-material culture. The material culture includes things like jewelry and art and buildings and weapons and utensils and machinery and clothing and hairstyles. And then our non-material culture involves a group's way of thinking, their beliefs, their values, their assumptions, and the common patterns of behavior. Things like language and gestures and other forms of interaction. People become comfortable with the customs they have learned since childhood. And we become uncomfortable with the customs of another culture. These practices, material and non-material culture, allow us to make assumptions that help us to navigate through our daily lives. Understanding how culture affects people's lives helps us develop our sociological imagination, that ability to see life as an outsider would, to see life from a broader lens. So, culture and this taken for granted orientation to life. Culture provides us with this taken for granted orientation. We assume that our own culture is normal or natural. It is not. It is learned. It becomes so part of our lives that we take for granted our speech, our gestures, our beliefs, our customs, our cultural lens, or the culture as a lens, provides that lens through which we perceive and we evaluate the things around us. We come into this world as a blank slate, and at an early age, we learn and we share ways of doing and believing what are normal. That's normal behavior for us. We learn the language and the values and the morality, religion, war, money, love, all these ideas who make up who we are. It's the culture within us. Culture provides us with instructions that tell us what we ought to do. And this moral obligation that defines what we think is either right or wrong. We don't question these things. We don't question these assumptions unless we immerse ourselves into a completely different culture. When we immerse ourselves into a completely different culture, coming into contact with that radical, completely different culture produces culture shock. And we can experience it when we're immersed in that other culture. But others can have that culture shock when they come to the United States. So if you've ever visited another country and you didn't know the language, or you didn't, know the foods, you weren't used to the foods that they ate, or the way they dressed, or the climate might have been either too cold or too warm. That's culture shock, because you're coming into contact with a radically different culture. Now, a consequence of internalizing culture is known as, or referred to as, ethnocentrism. And this is when we use our culture as the one to measure all others against. So we believe that our culture is good and right and even superior to others. It is functional in that it creates in-group solidarity. People develop a pride or sense of patriotism, but it is dysfunctional because it can lead to discrimination, this ethnocentrism. Now, practicing cultural relativism, so if we, or some groups practice ethnocentrism, that view that their own culture is the standard, we can instead practice cultural relativism, where we understand a culture on its own terms without considering any elements as any better or worse than our own culture. And this is often very difficult to do because we tend to use our own culture to judge others. If we take, for example, there is a culture in Madagascar village that they're known for a practice called dancing with the dead. And so if we think about walking in those individual shoes, of what the Madagascar do is they, after a family member has passed away and they've buried them, they will at some point in time exhume their loved one and have a big celebration. And they tell this person who's passed on, all the things that they've missed while they were gone, and they dress them up in elaborate clothing, and they play music, and they really celebrate that person's life. And a person who's living goes to their death knowing that this will happen to them someday. And so it's a very well-known practice in this part of the world. But we need to, we would never think of doing that here in the U.S., but we need to consider it from that perspective, that history, the folklore, the traditions. And take for another example, bullfighting in Spain. Trying to understand bullfighting in Spain. It's a long history of tradition. Now a lot of animal rights activists here in the United States might fight against it. If we were to try it, I'd have, say, Wells Fargo Center down in Philadelphia. Could you imagine the running of the bulls down Broad Street? Something like that taking place. We can't imagine it happening here in the United States, but in Spain, again, it's something it's a common practice. It's part of their culture. It helps us understand, anyway, that behavior. Now, because we tend to use our own culture as that standard, cultural relativism prevents the challenge, but it will help us to appreciate other ways of life. We can understand and appreciate why the Madagascar dance with the dead and why the Spaniards fight with bulls. But for us, it may still be regarded as a strange practice because of how ingrained our culture is with us. So we need to refocus our lens of perception to appreciate other cultures. The lens of our culture asserting that it is the only right way. Now, according to anthropologist Robert Edgerton, in his work Sick Societies in 1992, he suggests that we develop a scale to evaluate cultures on their quality of life, the way we rank U.S. cities. He argues that, cultures that practice exploitation, that exploit women and children, for example, they're not morally equivalent to those that do not. So in other words, cultural practices that exploit should be judged as morally inferior to those that, say, enhance people's lives. Edgerton's argument is an attempt to address the disagreement among scholars. that are trying to confront the contrasting views of reality. We're going to talk about some of the components of symbolic culture. Non-material culture is often referred to by sociologists as symbolic culture because symbols are the central component. Symbols are things to which people attach meaning and that we use to communicate with one another. Gestures, our language, values, norms, and sanctions, they kind of all go together. And folkways, mores, and taboos. The word is spelled mores, but it's pronounced mores. So first we'll talk about gestures. Gestures, or using the body to communicate with others, are a shorthand way to communicate or send a message without using words. People in every culture use gestures, although the gestures and the meanings may differ. Facial expressions, body language. Now, confusion or offense can actually result because of a misunderstanding over the meaning of a gesture or a misuse of a gesture. I wish we were in class in person because I have an activity that kind of illustrates this. Certain gestures, we kind of go over and see, do we understand collectively what they mean? Can they mean something different to someone else? I'll give you one example. In Greece, if you go like this, what do we mean? Yes or no? Usually this means yes and this means no. Well, in Greece, it's the exact opposite. So when you're speaking to somebody who has a different interpretation, you're not sharing that meaning of that gesture, and so therefore communication can break down or confusion can ensue. Because some gestures are closely associated with emotion, emotional messages, the gestures themselves can often elicit emotion. Now, so it can lead to misunderstandings. There's a disagreement over whether or not there should be universal gestures. Is it really true that there are no universal gestures? Anthropologists claim there are none. Ethologists or researchers who study the biological basis for behavior claim that facial expressions like anger and fear and sadness and pouting are in our biological makeup and are universal. But I don't know if you could see it behind my video here, but symbols for medical attention or danger or hazardous poison symbols, are there some symbols that can be universally understood? Next thing we're going to talk about are the elements of culture. And the elements of culture include language, and they also include norms, values, and sanctions. So first we'll talk about language. The primary way people communicate with one another is through language. And language is a system of symbols that can be put together to communicate abstract thoughts. We could put together an infinite number of ways to communicate this abstract thought. Each word is a symbol to which a culture attaches a particular meaning. All human groups have language, but the meanings, the sounds may differ by culture. Language allows culture to exist. It is important because it is the primary means of communication between people. Now, language allows human experience to be cumulative. It means we pass ideas, knowledge, attitudes on to the next generation through language. Each generation builds on the experiences passed on by the previous generation. We can modify our behavior based on what earlier generations have learned. Now, the sociological significance of language is that it allows us to move beyond our immediate experiences, permitting culture to develop. Without language, human culture could not have advanced beyond the lower primates, grunting and gesturing. It frees us from the present and allows us to speak of a past and a future. Through language, we're able to discuss past events with others, sharing memories with words used to describe the experiences, assigning words to an event, using those words to recall it. We're able to discuss the event. It brings up certain feelings. So if we say 9/11, that has a certain meaning for those people who lived and experienced what happened on September 11th, when the Twin Towers and the attack occurred in the United States. People who lived that experience, people who lived before that experience, it just brings up certain memories, and people can share those memories, that events. The significance is that as we talk about past events, we develop a shared understanding about what those events mean. Through talk, people develop a shared past. Language also provides a social or shared future. It allows us to plan future activities with one another, times and dates and places. Without language, it would be impossible to set and communicate goals, times, plans. Language allows shared perspectives. When we talk to one another, we're exchanging ideas about events. That is, we are sharing perspectives. Talking about events with one another allows us to arrive at the shared understanding that form the basis of social life. Words embody experience into an exchangeable form that's mutually understandable to those who have learned that language. Not sharing language results in miscommunication and could even result in suspicion. You might not know what somebody's saying. You think they might be saying something suspicious. Language allows for shared, goal-directed behavior. Through our common understandings of words, it enables us to engage in complex, shared, and goal-oriented behavior. Our use of speech and language allows us to decide the when, the where, the what, the who. Language allows us to establish a purpose for our activities. So we take language as meaning the basis. Language is for us the basis of culture. Now, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. There were two linguists, Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf. There were two anthropologists as well in the 1930s studying the Hopi Indians of the southwestern United States. They noticed that the Hopi had no words for past, present, and future. Well, English and many other languages did have words for those, past, present, and future. So from this observation, they began to think that words might be more than the labels that people attach to them. So their hypothesis states that our thinking and our perception not only are expressed by language, but actually our thinking and perception are shaped by language, because we're taught not only the words, but also a particular way of thinking and perceiving. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis challenges common sense. Rather than objects of events forcing themselves into our consciousness, it is our language that determines our consciousness and our perception of objects and events. So according to Sapir and Whorf, their hypothesis states that language precedes thought, You need to have language to have thoughts. You have a thought and you don't have the language to express it. So it's like what comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of hypothesis. Language is not given. It's not a given. It's culturally determined. Language is culturally determined, and language may influence how we see the world. So learning a language means not only learning words, but also acquiring perceptions that are embedded in that language. Language both reflects and shapes our cultural experience. Basically, language is more than words. The second element, language is the first element of culture. The second element of culture are our values, norms, and sanctions. So they kind of all come in a bundle. Culture includes values, norms, and sanctions. And the values are the ideas people have of what is desirable in life, what we value in life. Values are the standards by which we define good and bad, beautiful and not so beautiful. Every group develops both values and expectations regarding the right way to reflect them. Now, norms are basically the rules of behavior. They're the expectations that develop out of those groups' values. Formal norms, we have formal and informal norms. The formal norms are generally written down. They're so important they're written down. And they specify strict punishment for violation of the norm. And these would include our laws, our regulations, and any kind of organizational rules. You know, I usually give this example in the class of driving. You know, we have rules of the road. We need to drive. We need to obey the laws, the rules of the road, or else we'll get a ticket, a fine. You know, if we run a red light, if we speed, there'll be violations. Informal norms are generally understood, but not particularly, you know, precisely recorded. These include standards of, you know, proper dress. You know, if you have a formal occasion to attend, you would expect to be a little bit dressy, if it's not so formal of an occasion, it's more casual, dress down Friday, for example, you would wear more casual clothing. Informal. These norms are most noticeable when they're broken, when they're not obeyed. So if, you know, I was teaching you in class, in person, and I came to class dressed in my wedding gown, that's not really the appropriate dress. No one's going to give me a ticket or a fine for wearing a wedding dress to teach class, but I might get a lot of laughs and you know, funny looks because it's really not the appropriate dress to be wearing to teach class. Sanctions are the reactions to following the norm or breaking the norm. So these are positive or negative reactions to the way people follow these norms. The positive sanctions are expressions of approval. So if you do a good job at work, you might get a raise. That's a monetary reward. If you do something nice for someone, you get somebody will thank you. You'll get a smile, a nod of approval. Negative sanctions are a reflection of disapproval for breaking a norm. Kids like to run up the down escalator. And there are a lot of people on the escalator and they have to zigzag in and out. And so they might get looks of disapproval. If you run a red light, you might get a fine or a ticket. Or if you're caught speeding. So again, those would be negative sanctions. If you don't do a good job, you might get fired from your job. So that's a negative sanction. For many people, to relieve the pressure of having to strictly follow these norms all the time, every day, some cultures have what are called moral holidays. And these are specified times when we're allowed to kind of break the norms. And a couple of years ago, I don't know if you remember, the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl. And so at that time, a lot of things were shut down in the city so that the city could celebrate. Traffic was closed off on Broad Street. Cars, people can just go and walk in the street. And it was very community building, and the fans were really rejoicing and celebrating. So a lot of times like that would be considered a moral holiday. A moral place might be, there was an expression at one point where um, uh, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. When you go on vacation, sometimes you might let loose. That's more of an appropriate time to kind of break the norms that you would normally have. Oh, Mardi Gras is another time in New Orleans where a lot of people like kind of let loose and celebrate and party. Those would be considered moral holidays and moral places where you might not strictly follow those norms. Now, norms vary in terms of their importance to a culture. We have what are called folkways. These are norms that are not strictly enforced. And mores, spelled Moors, but it's pronounced mores, M-O-R-A-Y-S. These are strictly enforced. The folkways are norms that are not strictly enforced. That is, we expect people to follow them, but it's no biggie if they do not. Going up the down escalator, I think I said a couple. Standing too close on an elevator, not holding a door open for someone when you walk through it. Not if someone puts their hand out to shake your hand, you don't take their hand too. It might be uncomfortable, but it's no biggie if you don't do that. You may get a dirty look. Other things, picking your nose in public. I don't know. Not to sound gross, but things like that. They're folkways. We don't, we have norms, but they're not strictly enforced. Mores, though, are norms that are believed to be essential to our core values, and we insist on conformity. A person who steals, who murders, who's violated society's most important mores. These norms help keep social order in our society, protect our people in society. So these are extremely important norms. Taboos are norms that are extremely enforced, and these are so ingrained that even the thought of them is considered repulsive. Incest taboo is one example. Eating human flesh would never, just the thought of it, just repulses us. So breaking a taboo, these sanctions are very severe. If you violate them, you might be, removed from society or put into jail, something like that. So extremely enforced norms. Now, the many cultural worlds, in other words, we have what are known as subcultures and countercultures. A subculture, these are groups whose values and related behaviors are so distinct that their members are set off from the dominant culture. Each subculture is a world within the larger dominant culture and has a distinctive way of looking at life. But they remain compatible with the dominant culture. So they exist within the dominant culture. Ethnic villages like Chinatown or Little Italy in New York, these are subcultures. So little ethnic villages are often known as subcultures. Now in the US we have thousands of subcultures. Some are based on age, some are quite broad. Teenagers are considered a subculture. They have their own language, I believe, because of the texting and the technology, and so they can be considered a subculture. Others are very narrow, like an interest in bodybuilding, fitness, a particular type of fitness, people who spin or people who run. That would be a subculture. Some ethnic groups form subcultures, as do occupational groups. So in other words, any subculture that may be based on a common age, a region, of the country, ethnic heritage, an occupation, a belief. These would be considered subcultures that are existing within the dominant culture. Now, countercultures are groups whose values set their members in opposition to the dominant culture. So the value, this is done in either a deliberate and very obvious way, really drawing attention in some way to their beliefs and values. While usually associated with negative behavior, some countercultures are not. So if we use, say, the hippies of the 1960s, for an example, as a counterculture, the hippies of the 1960s were anti-war. They were anti-establishment, against the accumulation of material goods. They were all about peace and love, and they had love, not just a sit-in, but they had a love-ins. So they were, again, protesting, but they were protesting in a very peaceful way, the dominant culture. On the other hand, we have terrorist groups and hate groups like the Aryan Youth Movement. These are also countercultures, but they are in fact fueled from very hate-filled ways, and so they terrorize people. They fuel their ways in very violent, hate-filled ways. Now, countercultures are often perceived as a threat by the dominant culture because they challenge the core values. And for this reason, the dominant culture will move against a particular counterculture, in order to affirm its own, core values. So the next thing we're going to talk about are these core values that I'm mentioning. The overall view of the U.S., about what are value clusters, value contradictions, the emerging value cluster, when values clash, and then values as a distorting lens, and ideal versus real culture. That's what we're going to move on to next. First, an overview of U.S. values. Because the U.S. is considered very pluralistic, or a society that's made up of many different groups, we have we have differing religious groups, we have racial ethnic groups, in addition to special interest groups that focus on specific activities like people who hunt, people who fish, people who collect. With all these different groups, sociologists have really tried to identify what are the U.S.'s core values, those values that are shared most among these groups. So sociologist by the name of Robin Williams, who's a sociologist, not the comedian Robin Williams, so the sociologist identified these 10 core values. So the first is achievement and success, especially doing better than others. You want to, it's very competitive. We want to achieve. Individualism is another core value. Success due to your own individual effort. Hard work and activity. Americans are expected to work hard to achieve success. There's no time for laziness. Efficiency and practicality. Things get done in an efficient, fast manner. Science and technology is a core value, using science to control nature and develop new technologies. Material comfort. Americans expect a certain level or high level of material comfort. Plenty of food and nice clothes and nice house, good health care and cars and recreation. We expect all of those material comforts. Freedoms. We expect our freedoms. These pervade U.S. life. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. Democracy. Example, majority rules. The right of everyone to express an opinion and have a representative government is another core value of the U.S. Equality, especially of opportunity. This has influenced our history, U.S. history, and relations between groups. Group superiority. Now, although it's a contradiction to freedom and democracy and equality, Americans have valued some groups more highly than others throughout history. For example, denying women the right to vote, killing Native Americans, enslaving Africans. So now Henslin, your author of your textbook, has added these last three values. Education. Americans are expected to go far in school. We value education. Today, a college education is an acceptable goal. Religiosity. Henslin added religiosity, feeling that every American has some sort of belief in a supreme being and follows some sort of matching rules or precepts or moral rules to regulate their behavior or even their thoughts. Doesn't mean we all need to go to church or join a church or a synagogue or mosque, just that there's some degree in belief there. And the last one is romantic love, and this is viewed as the basis for marriage. Pop culture stresses this value in songs and literature and magazines and mass media. So those are the overview of all 10 of the U.S. core values. Now, values are not independent units. They're usually made up of related core values that come together to form a whole. So, for example, the value clusters, we have value clusters that are made up of those related core values. So say we wanted to, what is the success, the value cluster for success? Well, we'd have education in there because, you want to go far and high in your level of education. You want to work hard to achieve success, work efficiently in order to achieve success, obtain a high level of material comforts that shows a sign of success, and be very, show a sign amount of individualism that you did this through your own individual effort. A lack of success would be blamed on, and that the individual due to his or her faults. So that would be an example of a value cluster of success. Now, some values conflict with each other, so we have value contradictions. You cannot have full freedom, democracy, and equality when you also have racism and sexism. Yet through our history, group superiority has been a dominant value. As society changes, some values become challenged, and they may also become modified. So at the point of value contradictions, we see a major source for social change. Eventually, something has to give. Civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, we see that, prompting and motivating that time for change. In response to fundamental changes in society, a cluster that is emerging is made up of these values, these U.S. values. Leisure, which is reflected in the huge recreational industry. People going, playing computer games, people going boating and spas and vacation homes, needing that time for leisure, and also self-fulfillment, expressed through human potential, the human potential movement, be all you can be, and self-help. You see, shelves and shelves of books talking about self-help magazines and personal development. That's all about, self-fulfillment. The physical fitness, it's not new in the U.S., but it's emphasized very much so today. We have health foods, organic weight and diet routines, growth in the health club industry, and fitness centers, and running and cycling groups, and all sorts of things to promote that physical fitness. And also the core value of youthfulness. We have a urgency today to remain young. The aging baby boomers are facing a lot of physical challenges. Considering aging is always viewed as a disease as opposed to something that's a natural process. we all want to postpone that for as long as possible. So we buy products to kind of slow that process down and make us look younger and feel younger. So this is a, emerging value cluster. Also emergent is becoming the concern for the environment. And so for most of our history, we've exploited the resources of our environment. But today there's the real genuine concern. We have laws against pollution. We have that whole recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle platform, concern for endangered species, and great concern for global warming when you see the far-reaching effects of global warming. So that also is becoming an emerging value cluster. Values are related to conditions in society typically, and value clusters become a response to some fundamental changes that are occurring within our culture. Now, core values do not change without meeting some resistance. So this is when values clash. Change is seen as a threat to the established way of life, something that will undermine the present and the future. Today's clash in values is so severe that we call it a culture war, culture wars. And this has been used, a phrase that's used to refer to it. Now, this clash in values is usually between the traditionalists versus those who are advocating for change. We want to see change. Back in the 1990s, the culture war referred to political debates. People who are in one or another side of a debate over topics like abortion or religious expression, gun control, sexual orientation. But people becoming polarized on issues like that, the traditionalists and those, again, advocating change for those particular topics. Values and their supporting beliefs may blind people to other social circumstances. The view of what life ought to be like can serve as blinders. The lenses are clouded to provide a glimpse of what life ought to be rather than what it actually is. So for example, when you see success stories, hard-working determination, stories that blind many people to the consequences of poverty. So people often do not see the reality of what is preventing success. If a family is in poverty, if they lack the education, if they're in a dead-end job, there might be something larger that's preventing them. So no matter how hard they work, no matter how determined they may be, that often the reality of which is preventing them from achieving that success is something that's quite different, beyond their control. But if we see someone who was homeless and living in their car and all of a sudden becomes a millionaire, we might still think that that might be a reality, and when truly that's not. It's putting a blinder on. Now, cultural universals are values, norms, or other cultural traits that are found everywhere. And although there are universal human activities, there's no universally accepted way of doing them. So some activities are universal. Courtship, marriage, funerals, games, sports. The activity is universal, but the expression of it will vary from culture to culture. And typically these cultural universals are intended to meet essential human needs, to provide food and shelter and clothing. So they're present in all cultures, but the specific customs might differ from one group to another. So let's talk about some of these. What are some examples of these activities that you might think would differ from culture to culture? what activities might be the same. So if we think of sports, a game like football, okay, so here in the United States, a football is sort of an oblong brown looking thing that, is thrown around the field, one end of the field to the other, kicked. You have to run into the end zone. I'm not a really big, don't know all the rules of a football game. However, if you're in Europe and you say football, it could be something quite different. They refer to what we call soccer. It's played with a round white ball, and you can't use your hands, and you have to kick the ball from one end to the other. So again, slightly different rules. It's a sport, but the way it's played may vary, the type of sport that it is. Just kind of an example. Now, sociobiology provides another view to the explanation of human behavior, as opposed to culture being the key. Sociobiologists would argue that as a result of natural selection, the basic cause of human behavior is biology and not culture. So just as physical characteristics and instinctual behavior in animals is the result of natural selection, so is human behavior. That is, the genetic traits that aid in survival tend to become common to a species, while those that do not will disappear. Edward Wilson was an insect specialist, and he argued the religion, competition and cooperation, slavery and genocide, war and peace, and envy and altruism can all be explained in terms of genetic programming. Now, most sociologists reject this claim. We do consider biology, but unlike other species, humans are capable of reasoning and abstract thought. Humans consider alternatives. We reflect on outcomes and make choices. So again, sociobiology kind of focuses on the biological and not culture, and we kind of focus on culture. So as another example is, it is in females' nature to be nurturing, and in males' nature to be the provider. Now, I don't know about you, but I know a lot of men who are very nurturing, and I also know a lot of women who are very good providers. Single mothers, for example, providing for their families. So again, it's relying on that genetic and saying all females or all males are one way or the other. Okay. As a sociologist, it's just kind of hard to fathom this. I think of culture more so. Okay. Technology. The new technology. Now, central to a group's material culture is its technology. In its simplest sense, technology can be illustrated with tools. Into its broadest sense, including the skills or procedures to make and use those tools. The emerging technologies that make a major impact on human life are referred to as new technologies. So these are the emerging technologies. The printing press and the computer are both examples of new technologies. The sociological significance of technology is that it sets the framework for non-material culture, influencing the way people think and how they relate to one another. It goes far beyond the tools themselves. This has a really significant impact on social life. Take, for example, the telephone. Before the telephone was invented, think about how did we communicate. You may have had to write a letter. It had to be sent maybe through the Pony Express, then the mail system, and then so eventually news got it took a long time to transmit news, and then the phone was invented, and we were able to call people and And that became improved upon, and it changed our behavior, it changed and improved. It has such a significant impact on social life. Now, if you think about the way we communicate with our phones today compared to generations ago, it certainly has an impact on social life, especially when you consider how we are all on lockdown in our homes and we have very minimal ways to communicate. We can communicate through our technology. So material culture and non-material culture. The material culture is described as the physical or technological aspects of our daily lives. The food items, the houses we live in, factories and raw materials that we have in our existence. And the non-material culture becomes the ways that we use those material objects, the customs, the philosophies, our beliefs, our government, our patterns of communication. Non-material culture is much more resistant to change than material culture. So, for example, not all parts of culture change at the same pace. We could, have a new material. So, for example, think about the internet. When the internet was developed and computers, that changed, but our belief system around how to use that computer, people today are still, struggling and trying to, use and learn all the different, capabilities that a computer might have for them. Just learning myself how to use certain platforms and certain software and being able to teach online. So, having that ability to have the material, but yet the non-material culture needs to catch up to those new changes. And what we call is, this change, this culture lag. William Ogborn, he's the person who coined this term to describe when material culture changes first and non-material lags behind. So it involves behavior changing more slowly than the technological changes. Technological advances are now so rapid that there can be cultural gaps between generations. And in this cartoon, I don't know if you could see the full text of it says basically just think of it as a long text message, and she's handing the young girl a book. Although for most of human history, due to limited communication and travel, cultures had little contact with one another. Yet there has always been some form of contact with other groups, whether it be through exploration, military defeats, or missionary work. These groups learned from one culture to another. So the transmission of cultural characteristics from one group to another is called what we call cultural diffusion, how we diffuse the different culture. It's more likely to produce changes in material culture than the non-material culture, but we spread those cultural traits from one group to another through trade, through travel, communication, the internet. Cultural diffusion occurs much more rapidly today, given the technology. You see, fashion and what people are wearing, and people hear music and read literature, and so you're seeing this culture, these different, materials that can be transported from one culture to another. Travel and communication have allowed us to make this connection to the other side of the world. So it leads to what we call this cultural leveling, where cultures become similar to one another. Like when we see cultures like Japan adopting Western culture, eating McDonald's hamburgers, for example, or dressing and the music and the economic production taking place.